Number 5 in our series on the book of Daniel. You remember Daniel has 12 chapters, so it's like a dozen eggs. You get a happy dozen and a few extra thoughts. And we're at number 5 in the series. And if you've been following this, you'll notice that there seems to be a bit of similarity. There's a pattern that seems to have emerged in this story. And we call this an accident at the king's party. Have you ever had one of those moments which you dread? You're at a funeral and your cell phone goes off. You're at a wedding, and as you're walking down the aisle, you trip and fall flat on your face. Well, maybe it's never happened to you, but I can guarantee you every one of us has dreaded that moment of happening. And we've said, especially as we're the father of the bride walking down, and you've got these huge, humongous bridal dresses, and they're flowing, and you're just so afraid that you might step on it at the wrong moment or even step at all, and something might happen. So definitely, we've all had those moments where accidents happen. Well, 6 years ago now, in the month of March 27th to be exact, 2015, an accident happened over in Europe. It was an Airbus 320 that was going from Barcelona to Dusseldorf, and despite their best efforts, a co-pilot locked out his pilot from the air cockpit and proceeded to descend at a rate that was designed to impact the plane and make it explode as it hit the mountain. It took about 8 minutes, and with all that they tried to do to get in there and overpower this co-pilot, because of the previous rule that said once the cockpit was sealed, nobody can get in. And so that was put in place after 9/11, you'll remember. And for those of you who followed that, it was a very distressful time. Because all 144 passengers and 6 crew perished in that accident. But that same week, there was a second airplane crash. Let me tell you about it. Maybe you'll remember. It was in Halifax at the airport, and an airplane was returning from Cuba in the middle of a snowstorm. This massive maritime storm had 160 kilometer an hour winds. And when the plane made its first attempt to land at about 8 p.m., the plane was rocked by such high winds that the pilot just said, forget this, and he took off again. We headed back to Montreal and waited for a second attempt. At 3 o'clock in the morning, they made a second attempt. It's about a 3/4 of an hour flight from Montreal to Halifax. And again, the plane, on its second approach, tried to land, but it was like a hurricane outside, and the plane had to take and lift up a second time. He decided to try to make a third approach. And when it finally came through on the third approach, it hit the runway, but it hit the runway 1,000 feet or approximately 3 football fields too early. And what that meant was, as he hit the plane, the ground, it was so rough, some thought the plane's tires had exploded. But we now learned that the entire undercarriage collapsed. It was a very rough landing. Many were in tears, some were sick, and some were applauding, but it was a kind of a muted applaud. But all escaped, alive and without injury. Maybe you'll remember that. It was called a miracle at the time, that every one of those people came through. Now here's 2 plane accidents. Both resulted in major crashes. Both resulted in major distress to the plane, but one all perished, and the second one all survived. This highlights the fact that there are 2 paths in life. They may look similar, but the differences are striking. Either enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many that go in by it. Narrow is the gate, and difficult is the way which leads to life. Few there are that find it. Matthew 7:13 and then 14. So let all true disciples of Jesus never take these verses or suggest that flame or destruction cannot come upon us. We can be cut, mangled, burnt, killed like any man or woman, but no destruction is possible without the Lord's divine permission. You are, as a believer in Jesus, invincible until your day of departure. That doesn't mean you will be not injured, but it means that you will not die until your appointment has been met. And that's one appointment none of us will be late for. In this case, these men in Daniel's time had more work to do, and they were rescued. King Nebuchadnezzar, or for that matter, any king, would not stop that. The book of Daniel is there to show and remind us to stand firm for God. In this day and age, when it's so easy to let people deflect you from serving the Lord, even when taken hostage, placed into forced celibacy, or forced to worship false gods, Daniel reminds us that one can still succeed in a pagan court under a pagan king, and that obedience to God is our highest calling. No temptation has taken you, except as is common to man, and God is faithful. He will not allow you to be tempted beyond what you are able. And he knows where that line is. Sometimes we think, oh, I can't take anymore. And he says, oh, yes, you can. And he lets us. And there's a reason for that, too. He says, no temptation will be taken as such as beyond what you are able, but with the temptation will also make a way of escape. But is that way of escape so that you can escape? Well, actually, the last part of the chapter, the verse, says it this way, so that you can bear it. You know, we like to escape temptation. We like to escape difficulties. We like to escape suffering. But he says sometimes you're going to be called to bear it. And we need to remember that there is a fourth man. Just as the three men in the furnace didn't see Jesus when they were standing before King Nebuchadnezzar, they didn't see Jesus when the men were gathering them in their trousers and tying them up and throwing them over their shoulders and walking up those broad staircase to the top of the furnace. They didn't see Jesus when they were thrown into the midst of that fire as they fell down. No, it wasn't until they got right to the bottom of the furnace and their bands were burnt away and they see Jesus. And the same is true for you and me. It's only after they committed themselves to God they saw Jesus revealing himself to them. This often happens in our own lives as well. He may do the same for you. Jesus is that unseen guest at every meal. He's the silent partner to every conversation. He's the gentle observer of every thought and intent of our hearts. And he's the one who will go through every difficulty you may experience. The word of God is clear. We can be confident of this one thing. He who has begun a good work in you will complete it until the day of Jesus Christ. Philippians 1:6. When God starts, he finishes. He don't make junk, and he always makes sure we come through whatever we need to come through. So with all that has happened, we can trust the fourth man to take care of us as well. Now, King Nebuchadnezzar needed to learn humility, and it was during those 7 periods of time, some think it was 7 months, some think it was 7 years, that when the king Nebuchadnezzar went mentally ill, when we were discussing it from Daniel 4, that period of time, you would have thought would have spoken volumes to every one of the family members of Nebuchadnezzar. And it was not until the king humbled himself, lifted his eyes to heaven, and finally sought help from the one who could help him, and that was God himself. So there are many gifted and talented people in the world. Some mistake, though, their talents as making them special in every field. They assume that, for example, if they can throw a 92-hour fastball, that suddenly makes them able to travel on an Indy 500 and drive at a fast speed as well. No, you see, God gives us special gifts in various ways, but no one has all the gifts. And so, what about you? Faith and miracles are just not in these people's vocabulary, but after reading today these problems of these people in Daniel, maybe you'll take a look at Jesus and call upon the Lord. You can be assured that if you have a sincere heart and you're longing for a new life, he will give you the answer you need. There is no salvation in any other, for there's no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. Acts 4:12. And so who is this Belshazzar? Did you know that for a long time, this character in chapter 5 of Daniel was one of the reasons why the liberal critics of Daniel, who suggested that Daniel didn't write this book way back in the period of time that we believe he did, which would be between 5 and 600 BC, but rather that he wrote it after all of the events had taken place. He wrote it after Greece had actually become a power. And no wonder he was so able to make prophecies according to the liberal critics. He already knew it. He was just talking about history and making it look like it was written before the history actually happened. So why did they do this? Because they couldn't find Belshazzar in any of the archaeological digs. He wasn't even around. So they said, oh, that's just somebody making something up in the book of Daniel. Can you imagine that? That's an affront, isn't it? Isn't it? Thy word is truth. Sanctify them by thy word. Thy word is truth. John 17, 17. Why does he say that? Because all of God's word is complete and true. No part is wrong. And every time they try to find something that's wrong from the archaeology, they discover they're wrong, not the Bible. Example, Belshazzar. In 1854, Sir Henry Rawlinson found an inscription of Nabonidus, which referred to his eldest son, and quite recently the site of a ravine undermined by heavy rainfalls fell in a suburb of Babylon, and a number of coarse earthenware vases were laid bare. They were filled with tablets and receipts and contracts, which showed that there was a Belshazzar. He had a household. He was with secretaries and stewards. And one was dated in the 3rd year of the king, Marduk-Shazar. Now, as Marduk was another name for Baal, this is the person, Baal, or Marduk-Shazar, or Belshazzar, who was also the king. In one of those contracts, dated in July after the defeat of the army of Nabonidus, we find him paying tithes for his sister, who was one of the princesses. So, the situation in front of us is about pride. It says in James 4:6, God is opposed to the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Don't you want to have something that's called grace in your life? It can only happen as you humbly approach the Lord, and he's always opposed to the proud. Well, why would we say that King Belshazzar was proud? Well, first of all, he makes a great feast of 1,000 guests, including his wives and concubines. For those of you who've studied the book of Esther, you'll remember that when there was a great feast in those days, the women and the men dined separately. When Esther had a great feast for her, or the queen had a great feast before Esther, her name was Vashti, when she had that great feast, and then the king of the day called her to come to his palace to display her beauty, she refused. Do you remember that story? And there were 2 separate feasts going on simultaneously. Well, Belshazzar throws propriety to the wind, and he says, no, we're going to have the concubines and the wives and all the rulers, 1,000 of you are going to be invited to this great banquet. And the interesting thing about all of this is this banquet was a unique banquet. What was going on outside the walls of that banquet? An invading army was sitting outside. Yes, the Medes and the Persians were camped outside the walls. And so while the army was sitting outside the walls of Babylon, instead of calling the army to the attention and putting them on a high alert, the king says, puts the thumb to the nose to the army and says, I don't care. We're in Babylon. You see, we have a city that is indestructible. It's unsinkable. Whoa. Wait, unsinkable. Wasn't the Titanic unsinkable? And this city was not indestructible. As they were drinking, as they were praising the gods of their day with intoxicating drinks, a mysterious hand emerges from the mist and begins writing on the wall. And you know, that mysterious hand we call the finger of God. In Exodus 8:19, the Egyptian magician said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them, just as the Lord had said. Finger of God, Exodus 31:18. And when he made an end of speaking with him on Mount Sinai, he, God, gave Moses 2 tablets of the testimony, and it was written with the finger of God. Deuteronomy 9:10, the Lord delivered the 2 tablets of stone written with the finger of God. You get it? The finger of God is another expression for when God breaks through and interacts with our material world. For God is spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and truth. But he sometimes does that, and sometimes it's just with a finger. And so Jesus says in Luke 11:20, if I cast out demons with the finger of God, surely the kingdom of God has come upon you. And so he even makes claim to be using the finger of God. I was reading a commentary. John Corsten is one of my favorite modern day commentators on the subject. He said that as he was growing up, he had a long-standing battle with his older brother. His older brother happened to be named Dave, so I have to say he had a good name. But he wasn't such a good guy. And what he would do with young John is he would start pointing his finger at him. And somehow he had convinced John that when he pointed his finger at John, bad things were going to happen. And so he would do this at the supper table. Did you ever have somebody that would do those kind of games at the supper table? And he would be sitting across the table from his brother Dave, and he'd be suddenly feeling like Dave's finger was pointing at him. And he would look underneath the table, and there Dave's finger would be looking straight at him. And he'd go, "Ah!" And he'd say, "Mom, Dave's pointing his finger at me." And she'd say, "Cut that out, Dave. You're just disturbing the table." And then a few minutes later, he'd do it again, and he'd feel that eerie feeling, and he'd look underneath, and there's Dave's finger pointed out again. And finally, I guess this was an ongoing thing. But here, the finger of God was the real power of God. And his daring bravado, Belshazzar's daring bravado was instantly changed into abject fear. Wow. I love what the account of Daniel says. His knees began to knock together. Isn't that graphic? You know, it's just, you can just hear the knocking sound. As he's knocking, his knees are just shaking, and he's just trembling with awesome. Why is he so afraid? Because he remembers how God had humbled his father Nebuchadnezzar. And he's afraid that same humbling is coming his way, and he's right. He is right. And so when Daniel was summoned after it, did you catch that? He always goes to the Chaldeans, the astrologers, the Medes, and the Persians. He always goes to the wise people first, never goes to Daniel first. Look, if you don't get picked first for anything, don't worry about it. God is the one we want to please. And Daniel didn't go around saying, "Oh boy, what a poor boy am I. Missed out again. I didn't get invited to the party. I wasn't part of the 1,000 guests. I missed out again. I didn't even get invited when they wanted someone to interpret." You know, the first dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, Daniel wasn't invited to interpret it. The second dream that Daniel interpreted, he was not invited. It was always going to the elite, the bigwigs. And when God deals, he deals with the humble and the obedient. Daniel says to Belshazzar, "The God who holds your breath and in your hands and owns all your ways, you have not glorified." This is what's happened. Therefore, God has numbered the years of your reign. It is now complete. Tekel, you're weighed in the balances of God's truth, and you are found wanting. Upsaran or Paris, alluding to the word for Persians, your kingdom has been divided between the Medes and the Persians. You know, this This is amazing because the kingdom had walls that were amazingly thick. We are told that the walls of around Babylon were so thick they could ride several chariots on the tops of the walls at once. They had 250 towers built around the walls. The walls were, in their view, impenetrable. He had 20 years provisions of supplies. They could be surrounded for 20 years and they could survive it. What army sits around a city for 20 years? And so they thought that they could survive this, but it wasn't to be. The king, Cyrus was his name, he came in and scratched his head and says, isn't that the river going through, the Euphrates River going through the city of Babylon? How about we just divert the river? And that's exactly what they did. They diverted the river, and while the city was in its riotous party mood, the entire army goes in under the walls on a dry riverbank in the dead of night. They come in, and within 24 hours, King Belshazzar is deposed and slain, and Darius the Mede is made the new king of Babylon. It's like they didn't have to fire a shot. They simply overpowered it by using wisdom, yes, but also by reminding people that no pride can stop the enemy, but only God can stop the enemy. So there's some lessons for us here, and we're running very quickly out of time, but I'll get 4 main lessons. Let's see if we can do this. Number 1, God holds all our breath. The next breath you take is actually controlled by God. Did you ever think about that? Well, you say, well, I control it. Well, up to about 5 or 6 minutes you do. If you want to stop breathing for 5 or 6 minutes, your control is pretty much gone by then. You can stop drinking water for 7 days. You can stop eating for 40 days, but try stopping breathing. And usually you're going to get into trouble by about 5-6 minutes. In fact, Adam was made, it says, out of the dust of the ground, and God breathed into him the breath of life, and man became a living being, Genesis 2:7. So over and over again in scriptures, it says the individual breathed their last breath. That's an interesting term. We all have a last breath. And Abraham breathed his last and died at an good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people. It was said that the manner in which Jesus gave out his last breath was that which convicted a soldier to believe in him. Now, this soldier had seen many men die. He had crucified perhaps many. But there was something different about Jesus when he died. Perhaps it was the cry, "It is finished," paid in full, John 19:30. Or even the statement, "Into your hands I commend my spirit." But when he cried out with a loud voice and breathed his last, the centurion, seeing this, said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God. Certainly, this man was a righteous man." So we're told that the last breath can be a revelation to others. Somebody said we're talking about how, as we age, we start to forget things. But I'm reminded of this truth, that while we may think we have forgotten a lot, God has never forgotten us. And I recall a story of a gal who had severe dementia, but her last breath was Jesus, as she looked up and a smile broke her face. Yes, there is a lot to the last breath, and God holds our breaths. Secondly, God owns all our ways. In other words, the king may have thought he was king who owned all, but in fact it was God who owned all his possessions. The king was only a representative to the people and was accountable to God for everything he did. The third lesson is that the king had not glorified the God of heaven, but rather had made light of the temple vessels, praising his Babylonian idols instead of praising the God of Israel. You think that seems a little bit trite, yeah? Would you say, why would God get so upset? I mean, after all, he was the conqueror. He was part of God's foreordained plan. But he still had to answer to an almighty God who had dictated that those vessels were sacred, were separate for the use of the sacrifices. Maybe those vessels had been used to carry blood in them. Maybe those vessels had been used to carry the water that was used at the festivals for cleansing. Whatever it was, these were sacred, and God says, do not come and touch that which is holy. And the king had not glorified the God of heaven. You know, there's a lot said about the glory of God, but I'm just going to put a couple of verses before you, and because we need to move this along. Isaiah 42:8 and Isaiah 48:11. I am the Lord, that is my name, my glory I will not give to another, nor my praise to carved images. Ever wonder why it is that there was only one person in human history that seems to have the ability to walk up to somebody and touch them and heal them instantly? When we have in the scriptures a passage like 1 Corinthians 12, which talks about the miraculous gift of healings, and why that doesn't seem to happen for very, very many people. It's simple. It's not that you cannot pray for someone and see them healed, but don't you dare step in and get the glory for it. And there's a lot of these so-called faith healers that get the glory, and they act like the power is coming from them, when it is not. It is coming from God, and God will not share his glory with another. And he says it twice. My own sake, for my own sake, I will do it. Well, how shall my name be profaned? I will not give my glory to another. And there is only one that is worthy of our adoration and our glory to give to him, and that is none other than Jesus Christ. Anything else is idolatry. It's worship of a man. And there are many men going around the world today claiming to have miraculously signs and gifts when they have none other than false fakery, and they have pseudo magic, and they're fake news, and they're getting rich by doing so. Because God has said in his word, and his word is the final authority, he doesn't share his glory with another person. And if you notice, even in the Acts of the Apostles, when Paul performed miracles, he would do the miracle, but he was careful about all those things. For example, when he squared off with that magician on the island of Crete, he said, you're going to be blind for a while. He didn't say blind forever. He said, you're going to have a temporary blindness. This is something that God has revealed to me to give to you. But he didn't say, I'm going to judge you as God. You cannot take the place of God, no matter what you do. The Medes and the Persians came in. King Darius was brought forth in less than 24 hours. So are the affairs of men. So let us walk this day in the knowledge that our breath, our ways, and our glory, any glory that we may achieve is not our own, but comes from God and belongs to God.